Our next speaker is Mr. Tom Hartley. Tom is well known to you as a politician and as a man who has opened the city cemetery to every section of the community in the last 10 years with his regular tours and, of course, his much reprinted book on the city cemetery. Tom and I often joke we divide the dead of Belfast between us. I do Friars Bush and he does the city cemetery. He has been Lord Mayor of Belfast from 2009 to 2011 and he's very interested in history and has written about history, and he's going to talk about a sense of nationalism in Belfast. Thank you very much.
When I was given this task, it actually set me a challenge because, of course, the narrative of my life is quite different in many ways to, for instance, the narrative of my father's life. And so I tried, in talking about the Northern Catholic population in the years around partition, to put myself in his mind and how he saw the events unfolding, and how he would talk to you today as a Northern Catholic. So my father, Tommy Hartley, he was born on the 28th of February 1904, and as a member of a Falls Road Republican family, the Hartleys saw themselves as belonging to a national political majority. However, my father's status in belonging to this majority changed overnight on the 23rd of December 1920 as a result of the Government of Ireland Act. This act, which is often referred to as the Partition Act, was brought into force on the 19th of April 1921, and it allowed for the creation of two parliaments in Ireland. On the 7th of June 1921, the 40 unionist members of the new Northern Parliament were sworn in. It was boycotted by the Sinn Féin and 6 nationalist members. For unionists, there were 2 categories of people in their new state. The loyal, or unionist, and the disloyal, or nationalist. Simply put, a unionist emphasis on loyalty framed those with a different political view as disloyal. Opposition to the state was seen as a threat, which was met with repressive measures and legislation. One of the most notorious pieces of legislation was the Special Powers Act. From that day to his death in 1978, my father, his family, and his community were trapped inside a state where they were categorized as disloyal and denied their political and economic rights. So let me begin by providing some context for the political conditions endured by Northern nationalists in the aftermath of partition. My starting point is the introduction of Gladstone's Home Rule Bill in 1886. Northern Unionists used their opposition to this Home Rule Bill as a means of consolidating the Unionist political project in the north of Ireland. Supported by the Conservative Party in Britain, 4 elements of Northern Unionism were unified under the banner of the Orange Order. What were these 4 elements? They were Big House Unionist, the new Protestant mercantile elite, Protestant political clerics, and the Protestant industrial working class and tenant farmers. Opposition to Home Rule in 1886 and again in 1893 provided Northern Unionists with the ideological framework for growth. In fact, they developed to such an extent that by March 1905 they were able to form a dominant and unified political organisation, the Ulster Unionist Council. What followed was the separation of Ulster Unionism from unionists throughout the rest of Ireland. Northern Unionists had consciously and deliberately created a defensive line across the map of Ireland based on their numerical, geographical and religious strength in the 9 counties of Ulster. It is in these developments that we find the genesis of partition. On the 25th of September 1911, the Unionist path towards separation was strengthened when a resolution was passed at a meeting of the Ulster Unionist Council with the purpose of framing a constitution for a provisional government of Ulster in the event of Home Rule being imposed by the Westminster Parliament. As is well known, 1912 was a key year for Unionists. On the 5th of January of that year, Colonel Wallace, Secretary of the Grand Lodge of Ulster, applied to local magistrates in Belfast for permission to engage in basic military training. Orange volunteers and Unionist clubs began to drill and train their membership in the use of arms. This drilling was a very early stage in the development of the Ulster Volunteer Force. On the 9th of April 1912, Edward Carson and Bonar Law, leader of the British Conservative Party, reviewed all Unionist and Orange volunteers at the Balmoral Showgrounds. On the 28th of September that year, the majority of the Unionist population signed the Solemn League and Covenant. Thus, it is fair to say that 1912 was a defining year for Unionists. Their defensive line was strengthened as they created the political and military capacity to mark out the physical boundaries of a future Unionist state. With the formation of the Ulster Volunteer Force in January 1913, three key institutions of Unionism had consolidated their power base throughout the north of Ireland. These were the Ulster Unionist Council, the Orange Order, and the UVF. These three institutions of Unionism would later be transformed into the three foundation pillars of the Northern State: the Unionist Party, the Orange Order, and the RUC&B Specials. In March 1914, the British Prime Minister Asquith proposed an amendment to the Third Home Rule Bill. This amendment allowed the counties of North East Ulster to vote on whether they would remain within a Home Rule Ireland. Thus, the amendment put partition on the political agenda. On the 20th of that month, 58 officers of the 3rd Cavalry Brigade in the Curragh military camp informed their superiors that if they were moved north, they would prefer to accept dismissal. This act of mutiny reinforced the psychological underpinning of the Unionist cause by the British ruling elite. On the 24th of April 1914, Unionist opposition to Home Rule was strengthened by Fred Crawford when he smuggled 25,000 rifles and 2 million rounds of ammunition into Larne Harbour. In fact, Fred had been smuggling guns into the north since 1910. Of course, the rise and development of Northern Unionism has a flip side: the violence inflicted on the Northern Catholic population, in particular the Catholic population of Belfast. An examination of the years 1886, 1893 and 1920 reveals a pattern of violence initiated by the Unionist industrial working class in the Belfast shipyards. On the 4th of June 1886, 150 Catholic labourers employed in the building of the dry dock were driven from the shipyard. On the 22nd of April 1893, 600 Catholic workers were driven out of the yard. 1912 saw the expulsion of 3,000 Catholics from the industrial sites across Belfast, and of course from the Belfast shipyards. It is also worth noting that in that year, many Protestant labour men were expelled from their workplace. It was estimated by the Catholic welfare organisation, the Catholic Protection Committee, that on the 20th of July 1920, 10,000 Catholic men and 1,000 women were expelled from the shipyards and other factory sites across Belfast. And I believe that the practice of expulsions from the workplace was a forerunner of the discrimination of Catholic workers practiced in the workplace in the northern state. On the 8th September 1920, the British government announced the creation of the A, B and C specials, many of whom were recruited from within the ranks of the UVF. By November that year, the specials were operational. This trend in recruiting the UVF was exposed on the 9th of November 1921 when a proposal by an RIC divisional commissioner to assimilate the UVF into British state forces in the north was leaked to the press. Between July 1920 and July 1922, 250 Catholics were killed in Belfast, 11,000 put out of their jobs, and 23,000 driven from their homes. Many thousands fled south, and over 1,000 fled to Glasgow. Over 500 Catholic-owned businesses were burned and looted. Between 1920 and 1922, this pattern of violence, accompanied by massive state repression, was the instrument by which Northern Catholics were bludgeoned into an acquiescence of partition. After the 7th of June 1921, the new Northern state quickly consolidated its hold on the 6 counties. The violence of that state was the cornerstone of Unionist rule. The Special Powers Act, internment and flogging, supported by a paramilitary police force with the Unionist militia, the A, B and C specials, were the foundations of the Northern state. In early 1922, a new paramilitary commando group of 7,500 men was formed, the C1 Specials. On the 15th of March of the same year, Dawson Bates, the Northern Minister of Home Affairs, introduced the Special Powers Act. On the 4th of April 1922, the RUC, made up of 2,000 ex-RIC men and 1,000 A Specials, replaced the RIC. On the 22nd of May, Craig introduced internment. By mid-1922, there were 16 battalions of military, 5,500 A Specials, 19,000 B Specials, and an unknown number of C Specials, and 7,500 C1 Specials operating throughout the 6 counties. All of them were armed and paid for by the British government. Alongside the use of repressive measures, Unionists began to reshape electoral boundaries. Their first move in this direction took place in April 1922, when many nationalist councils were stood down and replaced by commissioners. This was quickly followed in July 1922 with a bill to abolish PR in local elections. This bill, passed in October 1922, empowered the Minister of Home Affairs to redraw electoral boundaries. Where nationalist majorities existed in urban and rural councils, the altering of electoral boundaries led to the sudden emergence of unionist-dominated councils. In the 1924 local government elections, nationalists controlled only 2 out of 80 councils. An enduring legacy of this period was a deep sense of despair across the nationalist community of being abandoned by the Free State government. This view fed into a strong undercurrent of nationalist memory in the 6 counties that after partition, the southern political establishment had turned its back on the plight of Northern nationalists and had left them stranded and alone inside a repressive unionist state. This sense of despair was made more painful when Northern nationalists and Republicans reflected on their contribution to the democratic struggles that shaped the course of Irish history. From 1922 until the collapse of Stormont, unionist domination of the nationalist community had 4 main interlocking elements. These were, first, the use of the Special Powers Act, which enabled suppression of political opposition to Northern Unionism. The second, the gerrymandering of political boundaries to maintain permanent unionist electoral majorities. Third, widespread practice of direct and indirect discrimination against nationalists in the workplace. And fourth, the discrimination against nationalists in the allocation of housing. Repressive legislation and a unionist judiciary was the enabling mechanism of state repression. The denial of political rights restricted the ability of the Northern Catholic population to highlight a political system which trampled all over their rights. Discrimination in the workplace imposed a barrier to economic opportunity and well-being. Discrimination in housing further compounded the effects of poverty. All of these measures were meant to produce a sense of powerlessness in the Northern Catholic population. In fact, the imprint of these four interlocking elements was embedded to such an extent in the unionist political psyche that they were openly endorsed by the unionist leadership. On the 12th of July 1933, the unionist Minister of Agriculture, Basil Brooke, in an infamous speech in Newton Butler, referred to a great number of Protestants and Orangemen who employed Roman Catholics. He felt he could speak freely on this subject as he had not a Roman Catholic about his own place. He continued by appealing to loyalists, and I quote, "wherever possible, to employ good Protestant lads and lassies." Only one day later, on the 13th of July 1933, the Stormont Minister of Labour, J.M. Andrews, said, and I quote him, "Another allegation made against the government, which is untrue, is that of the 31 porters in Stormont, 28 are Roman Catholics. I have investigated the matter, and I have found that there are 30 Protestants and only one Roman Catholic. There only temporarily." The following year, on the 19th of March, when speaking to the annual meeting of the Londonderry Unionist Association, Basil Brooke, or Brookburn, referred to his Newton Butler speech, and I quote him, "I would assure you, however, I have not lost one night's sleep over it." On the 9th of April 1948, the Unionist MP E.C. Ferguson, speaking in Enniskillen, said, and I quote him, "The Nationalist majority in the county, notwithstanding a reduction of 336 in that year, stands at 3,684. We must ultimately reduce and liquidate that majority. This county, I think it can be safely said, is a unionist county. The atmosphere is unionist. The boards and properties are nearly all controlled by unionists. But there is still this milestone around our necks." And that's the end of his quote. Mr. Ferguson resigned as MP in October 1949 to take up the position of Crown Solicitor for County Fermanagh. This attitude was best summed up in the November 1949 issue of the official organ of the Ulster Unionist Council. Referring to local government votes, it stated, quote, "By the latter, the Ulster people put into office those who can wield for weal or woe the power transmitted by our Stormont government. Nor is this power negligible when one considers the making of appointments, the letting of houses, and the provision of health, medical, education, and other services." The effect of this discrimination over decades left the Northern Catholic population with a sense of fear and isolation, and of being uprooted from their own space. For many, there was no way out other than to endure the humiliation of the unionist political regime. As always, when I am putting a speech like this together, I thought, well, what does that mean in the context of the lives of people that I know? And are there many who have suffered this sense of being uprooted? Because my enduring sense of being born in the northern state and being a northern nationalist and being born inside the Northern Catholic population was an upheaval or being uprooted from my sense of place. That I was meant to feel an alienation in the place of my birth. And so I started to look at individuals that I knew who had been uprooted in a most brutal fashion. And I want to start with my mother, who in 1935 was a stitcher in a factory owned by the father of Brian Faulkner. And in that year, her and her sister and other Catholics were put out and had to be taken out of the factory in cage cars. And my aunt, my mother's sister, had a complete nervous breakdown and never recovered from that. And I always remember my mother saying one of the things she couldn't understand is that a week before she was put out, that one of those who were being around the cage car as they were brought out was a woman that she had gone round the factory floor to lift a few shillings for a wedding present. She, even in the 1970s and 80s, she couldn't quite get that one worked out in her head. And then I was looking and researching Milltown Cemetery. I was looking at the life of a man who had been one of the last tram drivers in Belfast, a Catholic man from the Falls Road. And he then had been put out of a house in the Willowfield in East Belfast. I was looking at another woman, Nora Murphy from Sevastopol Street, had been put out of her house on the Donegal Road. I remember my Aunt Tilly. My Aunt Tilly was an elderly lady who lived in Bombay Street, and I went with her niece. She used to throw me out of the house every night at 11. 1969, she lost everything when her house was burned down. I think of Mrs. Stringer. Mrs. Stringer had lost her husband, who was a merchant seaman, and she had lost him during the Second World War when he had been torpedoed. His ship had been torpedoed in mid-Atlantic. She lived in Duffy Street between Dover Street, off Dover Street between the Falls and Shankill. She lost everything when she was put out of her house. My uncle Redmond, who'd been a sergeant major in the British Army, was put out of his house in Dover Street. And the list goes on. And so this sense of being uprooted had a very physical and brutal dimension for Northern Catholics. And the experience of being put out of your house is still remembered by families and is still a very conscious feeling. And of course, I think it captures the idea of what unionism meant to the Northern population in the aftermath of partition. Thank you very much.